In Android, two applications don't have a direct ability to look at one another's data because each application runs in its own sandbox. And that's where content providers come in. Content providers allow you to access data that's been surfaced by other applications. Now, you can also write your own content provider if you want to allow other applications to access your data. So in this example, I'm going to show you how you can access the contacts information on the phone. So the contacts application has provided a content provider so that we can actually look at that data. So I've created just a blank Android project. I've called it Content Provider. Now, if we want to access contact information, we have to actually add a permission in the manifest file. So let's go into the manifest file and go to the Permissions tab, and we're going to click Add Uses Permission. And the permission we want to ask for is android.permission.readContacts, which is right there. And this will now give us the ability to look at the contact data on the user's phone. Okay, so let's go into our Java code. And all we're going to do is to iterate over the contacts on the phone and just print out the contact name, and we're just going to send it to Logcat. So the first thing we have to do if we want to access data from a content provider is to create an instance of the cursor class. And the cursor class is essentially a class that lets us iterate over a set of data. So I'm going to call this people. And the way in which we actually can access a content provider is using a content resolver, which basically allows us to give a URL to a content provider and query it. The way content providers work is they all operate off of a URI, which is an address that we give in order to access that data. So to get the content resolver we're going to use the getContentResolver method here, which is going to get us the content resolver. And we're actually going to directly call query on this. And this allows us to now send a query to the content provider. So the URI that we need to give to be able to access the contacts information is actually in the contacts contract class. And then inside of that, there's a contacts class. And that provides a set of constants. And we actually want to get this content URI constant here. And this now gives us the URI to get the contact information. Now, there's 4 other arguments in here that we need to pass something in for. In really large sets of data, we may want to limit things like, hey, only return these specific columns, because that can help with things like performance. But these other options in here, we're not going to worry about in this example, so I'm just going to set them all to null. Like that. So now essentially we've called out to the contacts content provider, and we've queried it and returned the data into this people object, which is a cursor. Now, to iterate over the data that comes back into this cursor, we're going to use a while loop. So I'm going to say while people, and then we're going to call the move to next method, and that returns a Boolean. So as long as there's another record to iterate through, we're going to keep going through this while loop. Now, inside of this while loop, here now we can actually get at the data that we want, which is the actual contact name. So the first thing we have to do is to determine what column index is the name column. So what we're going to do is to create an integer here, and I'm just going to call it name index. So we need to find out what is the index number of the column we want to retrieve. So the column we want to retrieve is actually the display name. So to find out what column index that is, we can go into people and call the getColumnIndex method. Now this is asking us to pass in a string for the column name. So in order to know what that string is, we can actually use a constant in the phone lookup class. So in the phone lookup class, there's a constant for display name. And you can see some of the other ones that are in there as well. But for right now, we just want the display name column. Okay, so now we have the index of the column that we want to retrieve. Now we just need to actually create a string to store that information. So I'm going to create a new string. I'm going to call it name. And then we're going to use the getString method of that people cursor. And you can see it's asking us to pass in a column index, which we retrieved in the last step. So we want to pass in name index. Okay, so now all I'm going to do is I'm going to log that out to logcat. So we'll do log.d for debug. And for tag name, I'll just put contacts all in uppercase. And then we're just going to put in that name that we retrieved. Let's make sure we import the log class. So you can see there's a very, very small amount of code needed to retrieve contact information. Now, there are lots of other built-in content providers in Android, things like reading browser bookmarks, and there's a whole host of them that you can access in this way. And again, a more advanced thing that you can do is if your application has data that you want other applications to be able to access, you can create your own content providers. Let's go ahead and run this. We'll run it as an Android application. And let's pull up the emulator here. We'll wait for this to load. Now, this doesn't have a visual component, so let's actually go to DDMS, and we will look at the emulator here. And you can see down here we have our debug line, which has a tag of contacts, and we can see the 3 contacts that are in there. So again, very easy to access built-in content providers in Android. And again, it's the only way in which you can actually access data from another application, because again, all applications in Android exist in their own sandbox.